The wind swept across the dry plains, carrying with it the faint smell of dust, pine, and old sorrow. The land stretched wide under a copper sky, the kind that made everything seem endless and lonely. Wagons creaked in the distance, wheels groaning against the hardened earth, while the cries of distant coyotes broke the silence. In that land, hearts were often as rough as the stones that dotted the desert. It was a place where love didn't always survive, and kindness could get lost in the dust as easily as a footprint in the wind. She stood by the edge of the small frontier town, her hands trembling against the coarse fabric of her dress. The woman's eyes, soft yet stormy, were fixed on the man who had once promised her forever. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and calm in a way that only men who never truly cared could be. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't explain. He simply told her it was over, that his future belonged elsewhere, and she was no longer a part of it. His words were cold, stripped of emotion, and when he turned his back, it was as though the last piece of her heart had gone with him. The town was small, full of whispers. People talked about her even before she reached the door of the general store. They said she should have known better than to love a man above her station. They said she had it coming. Her cheeks burned from the shame of it, but she held her chin high. She didn't want them to see how much it hurt. Every step she took after that rejection felt heavier, as though the ground itself didn't want her anymore. By the time she reached the small cabin she called home, the sun had fallen behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of purple and fire. She closed the door quietly, her eyes resting on the empty room. Everything reminded her of him, the chair he once sat in, the shelf he built for her books, the small tin cup he used for his coffee. She wanted to scream, but only silence came out. Her tears were dry, the kind of tears that burn on the inside. Outside, the night deepened. The sound of the wind changed. It carried something else now, a warning. The people in town always spoke about the Apache raiders who rode through the hills. They said they moved like shadows and struck without mercy. Mothers told their children stories of them to keep them close at night, but she had never seen one herself. She didn't know the face of fear until that evening when the sound of distant hooves echoed through the valley. Her heart quickened. She reached for the small rifle near the window, though her hands shook so badly she almost dropped it. The horses were getting closer. There was shouting, harsh, foreign, carried by the wind. She peeked through the crack in the wooden shutter and froze. Torches, dozens of them. The orange flames moved like ghosts in the dark. She thought of running, but where could she go? The plains stretched for miles, and there was no one left to call for help. The attack came fast. She could hear the screams from the nearby ranch, the breaking of glass, the sharp crack of gunfire. She backed away from the window, clutching the rifle so tightly her knuckles turned white. The cabin door rattled. She fired once into the air, hoping to scare whoever was out there, but it only made things worse. The door splintered under a heavy blow, and the next thing she knew, strong hands pulled her down to the floor. The rifle slipped away. When she opened her eyes again, the room was filled with smoke and firelight. Men moved quickly through the space, their faces painted, their hair long and tied back with leather. Her breath caught when she saw one of them taller than the rest, his expression calm but dangerous. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and when they met hers, she felt something strange inside her chest. He didn't look like the others. There was a quiet control about him, a power that didn't need to shout to be felt. The others called him by a name that sounded like the rumble of thunder. She didn't understand the words, but she felt the weight of them. He stood there, watching her struggle to rise, and said something in his own tongue. She couldn't understand, but there was no cruelty in his tone. Still, his presence filled the room with tension. The fear that had once frozen her began to change into something else, something that made her pulse race in a way she couldn't explain. The leader looked around the cabin, his gaze falling on a small photograph on the wall, the one she had taken with the man who had rejected her. His jaw tightened, and his expression darkened. He tore the photograph from the wall and dropped it into the fire. She gasped, reaching forward. But before she could say anything, he caught her wrist, his grip firm but not painful. His eyes locked with hers again, and in that moment, something wordless passed between them. He spoke to his men, and they began to leave. She didn't know what he said, but soon she was the only one left with him in the smoky cabin. He looked at her once more, then pointed toward the door. It was clear she was to come with him. She wanted to refuse to fight, but her strength was gone. Somehow deep inside she felt that refusing him would not end well. Outside, the night had turned colder. The moonlight glowed against the burned remains of the nearby ranch. The air smelled of ash and pine. The leader led her to his horse, a massive black stallion that looked wild enough to throw any man who tried to tame it. He mounted first, then motioned for her to climb up behind him. When she hesitated, his hand reached down, steady and patient. She placed her hand in his, feeling the rough calluses of a man who had lived his whole life by strength and survival. She didn't know what fate awaited her beyond the hills. She didn't know his name, only the fear that surrounded it. But as they rode into the darkness, something inside her shifted. For the first time since she had been rejected, she didn't feel weak. The fear was real, but so was a strange sense of belonging, as though this unknown path was where she was meant to go. Behind them, the town lights flickered faintly, growing smaller with every mile. Ahead lay the wild land of the Apache, filled with danger, mystery, and perhaps something she could not yet name. The sound of the horses' hooves echoed through the valley, steady and sure. She clung to him, unsure if it was from fear or something else that stirred deeper within her heart. The man she had once loved was gone, but the man she now rode with was feared by all. Somewhere between fear and fate, her story had just begun. And though she could not yet see the road ahead, she knew that nothing about her life would ever be the same again. The wind rose once more, whispering through the canyons as if carrying secrets of what was to come. The torches behind them faded into darkness, and only the steady rhythm of the stallion's gallop remained. Leading her deeper into the unknown, world ruled not by promises or heartbreak, but by power, instinct, and the wild heart of the land itself. And as the first light of dawn began to touch the horizon, she looked back one last time. Somewhere in that fading town was the life she had lost. But in the wilderness ahead, perhaps waited the life she was always meant to find. The morning light broke over the horizon, painting the desert in pale gold. The air was sharp and dry, carrying the faint smell of smoke from the ruins they left behind. She rode silently behind him, her hands clutching the worn leather of the saddle, her eyes fixed on the endless stretch of wilderness ahead. The rhythm of the horse beneath her was steady, the world around them strangely quiet after the chaos of the night. The man did not speak. His back was straight, his long dark hair tied loosely, moving with the wind. Every movement he made was controlled, precise. There was a quiet strength about him, the kind that didn't need words to command attention. She watched the way he guided the horse through narrow passes and rocky trails, as though he had traveled them 1,000 times before. He seemed a part of the land itself, untamed, powerful, and unyielding. She wanted to ask where he was taking her, but fear held her voice. She didn't know if he would understand her words, and even if he did, she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Instead, she studied her surroundings. The hills rose high on either side, and the air grew cooler as they moved deeper into the wilderness. Birds circled above, and the distant cry of an eagle echoed across the canyon. The land felt alive, ancient, and full of secrets. Hours passed before they stopped near a stream that ran between tall rocks. The water was clear and cold, reflecting the sky like glass. He dismounted and motioned for her to do the same. Her legs trembled when her feet touched the ground, and he noticed. Without speaking, he reached into a small pouch tied to his horse and handed her a piece of dried meat and a strip of leather to drink water from. His eyes met hers briefly, and though his face stayed unreadable, there was something in his gaze, something that wasn't cruel. She hesitated before taking what he offered. Hunger eventually won over pride, and she ate quietly, glancing up every now and then to see him tending to his horse. He moved with purpose, his hands sure and calm. She realized then that he wasn't just a warrior, he was a man of discipline. Every gesture, every decision seemed to have meaning. When she finished, he looked toward the rising sun and spoke a few words in his own language. His voice was deep, steady, carrying a strange rhythm that sounded like a prayer or command to the wind. She couldn't understand the words, but they didn't sound harsh. It was as if he was speaking to the land, to something greater than himself. The more she looked at him, the more questions filled her mind. Why had he spared her? Why had he burned her home but taken her with him? What would happen when they reached wherever he was taking her? She wanted to believe that he had a reason, but in the wilderness mercy was rare. As the day went on, they rode again. The terrain changed from open plains to dense forests of pine and oak. The smell of wild herbs and earth grew stronger, and the air turned cooler. She began to notice the small signs of life around Hertha, rustle of rabbits in the brush, the shadow of a hawk passing overhead, the faint smoke from what could have been a distant campfire. Wilderness was harsh, but it wasn't empty. It breathed. By sunset, they reached a plateau overlooking a vast valley. Below, she could see smoke rising from several fires and figures moving among tents made of hides and wood. It was an Apache camp lived with movement and sound. The sight made her heart pound. She had heard the stories in town, the warnings whispered in fear, but now she was riding straight into the heart of it. The man stopped his horse at the edge of the camp, and several others approached, their eyes sharp and curious. They spoke quickly in their language, glancing from her to the man. There was tension in their tone, but also respect. It was clear he held authority among them. He answered calmly, his voice low and even, and whatever he said made them back away, allowing the two to pass. As they entered the camp, she could feel eyes on her. Women paused from their work, children peeked out from behind their mothers, and men stood still, watching. Some looked at her with suspicion, others with curiosity. She lowered her head, clutching the sides of the horse, trying not to show her fear. He stopped near a large tent set apart from the others. It was decorated with symbols painted in red and white, and feathers hung from the entrance. He dismounted and motioned for her to follow. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the scent of burning herbs. A few older men sat near the fire, their faces lined with years and wisdom. They looked at her, then at him, and began speaking in their language. From their gestures and expressions, she could tell they were questioning him. One of them pointed at her, his eyes narrowing. The man replied firmly, his tone respectful but unyielding. Whatever he said made the elders fall silent. "Oh!" After a long moment, one of them nodded slowly, and the man turned to her, motioning for her to sit near the fire. She obeyed, sitting on a soft rug made of animal hide. The warmth of the fire eased the chill in her bones, but her heart still raced. The man stood beside the elders, his tall figure outlined by the flickering light. They spoke again, and she could feel that whatever decision was being made involved her. After what felt like hours, the elders rose and left the tent. The man looked at her, his expression unreadable as always, pointed to the ground near the back of the tent, where a bed of furs was laid out. It was clear that she was to stay there. She nodded, too tired to protest. When he left the tent, she finally let out the breath she'd been holding. The silence pressed in around her. She lay down, staring at the tent ceiling, tracing the shadows cast by the firelight. Her mind was full of questions with no answers. Who was he to these people? What did he want from her? Why had the elders agreed to let her stay? Sleep came slowly, restless and uneasy. She dreamed of fire, of running through endless plains, and of those dark eyes watching her through the smoke. When she woke, the camp was alive with the sounds of mourning. Children's laughter mixed with the rhythmic beat of drums. Outside, she could hear the man's voice giving orders. A woman entered the tent, carrying a wooden bowl of food and a jug of water. Her expression was calm, and though she didn't speak English, her gestures were kind. She pointed to the bowl, urging her to eat. The simple act of kindness made tears sting her eyes. She nodded, whispering a soft thank you that the woman probably couldn't understand. Days passed. She began to see the rhythm of life in the camp, the way the people worked together, how they respected the land and each other. Despite her fear, she couldn't deny the strange beauty in their way of life. The children were curious about her, sometimes laughing as they tried to mimic her words. The women watched her but didn't treat her cruelly. And the man, the one they called their leader, remained distant but present. He often rode out at dawn with other warriors and returned at sunset, his expression solemn, his hands sometimes marked with dirt or blood from the hunt. Whenever he entered the camp, everyone quieted slightly, showing their respect. It became clear that he wasn't just feared by outsiders, he was honored among his people. One evening, she saw him standing alone by the fire outside his tent, the wind tugging at his hair. She wanted to speak to him, to thank him for not harming her, to ask why he had brought her here. But as she approached, he looked up, and something in his eyes stopped her. There was no threat there, only a deep, distant sadness that made her chest ache. The fire crackled between them, lighting the shadows on his face. He spoke softly, saying her name for the first time. The sound of it startled her. It was gentle, almost careful, as if he wanted to understand it. Then he said something in his language, a word she didn't know, but the tone carried meaning. It sounded like a promise, or a truth, too deep for translation. Before she could ask what it meant, he turned away, looking out toward the dark hills that surrounded the camp. The night was quiet, the stars bright above them, though she didn't know what fate awaited her in this strange land. She felt that their paths were now tied together by something stronger than fear or chance. The wilderness whispered around them, carrying the sound of the drums, the wind, and the heartbeat of a story that had only just begun. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of life in the Apache camp became both strange and familiar to her. The mornings began with the smoke of campfires curling into the pale dawn sky, the scent of pine and roasted corn in the air. The people worked together, each with a purpose that tied them to the land. Women ground maize, men sharpened their weapons or repaired saddles, and the children ran freely through the open spaces. Yet even in the quiet moments, there was tension that never truly faded. She could feel it in the glances the people exchanged, in the way they sometimes fell silent when the leader passed by. He remained distant most of the time, though his presence was everywhere. The people respected him deeply. Whenever he rode through the camp, heads lowered slightly, and when he spoke, everyone listened. She learned from whispers and gestures that he had earned his place through battle and wisdom, not just by inheritance. He had fought to protect his people when others would have surrendered. But there was more to him than the stories told, something that even his own tribe didn't speak about. One afternoon, while helping a woman named Atsa gather herbs near the stream, she overheard two young men talking. They didn't notice her, or perhaps they thought she couldn't understand. They spoke in fragments of English mixed with Apache words. What she understood chilled her. They mentioned vengeance and the white soldiers who had broken a peace promise. They spoke of raids planned in the coming weeks, of reclaiming what had been taken. And then they mentioned her name. Her heart pounded as she listened. They didn't say much, but one of them laughed bitterly, saying she was a reminder of the people who had betrayed them. The other told him to stay quiet, that the leader had his reasons for keeping her alive. She froze at those words. His reasons. What reasons could he possibly have? That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat outside her tent, watching the glow of fires and listening to the steady beat of drums echo through the valley. The leader stood near the edge of the camp, talking to several men she recognized as warriors. Their voices were low, but their expressions were sharp, focused. The conversation seemed heavy with decision. When it ended, the men left, but he remained. His gaze turned toward the dark hills. Curiosity pushed away her fear. She approached slowly. The crunch of sand beneath her feet made him turn his head slightly, though he didn't seem surprised. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The night air was cool, and the only sound was the faint rustle of leaves. Finally, she asked in a quiet voice why he had brought her here. He looked at her for a long moment before answering. His English was broken, but clear enough. You were left alone. His words came slow, careful. Others would have died that night. She swallowed hard. But you burned my home. You killed the people I knew. His jaw tightened. War takes from all. His voice carried no anger, just a weary truth. People took from mine first. She didn't know what to say. The stories she had grown up hearing painted the Apache as ruthless. But now, standing before him, she saw something different. There was pain behind his calm, a burden he carried silently. When she asked what the men had been discussing, he said only one word: retaliation. After that night, she began to see the lines of conflict more clearly. The camp was preparing for something. The men sharpened their weapons more often. The women stored food, and scouts left daily, returning with news from the borderlands. Fear and purpose wove through the camp like invisible threads. And though she tried to stay out of their way, she couldn't ignore the feeling that she was caught in the center of something far greater than herself. One evening, Atsa handed her a woven shawl and said softly, "You must stay close when the sun sets. There are eyes that do not see you kindly." The woman's kindness had grown into quiet friendship, but her warning carried weight. The same night, when she went to fetch water, she caught sight of one of the younger warriors following her. His expression was dark, filled with resentment. She hurried back, but the encounter left her shaken. Later that night, the leader came to her tent. His face was unreadable, but his tone was firm. "Do not leave alone," he said. "Some do not understand." She met his eyes, feeling both fear and a strange sense of safety in his words. "They hate me, don't they?" "They hate what you remind them of," he said simply. "The soldiers who burned our villages, the people who broke peace and took our land. You are not them, but they see no difference yet." The honesty in his voice struck her harder than any threat could have. She realized then that his battle wasn't just with the soldiers beyond the hills, it was with the anger within his own people, the grief that refused to fade. Days later, everything changed. Scouts returned with grim faces and news that soldiers were moving through the nearby valley. There were rumors they planned to strike the Apache camp, believing it to be the source of recent raids. The tension that had been simmering now broke open. The camp buzzed with preparation, every person moving with quiet urgency. She watched from the edge, torn between fear and concern. She wanted to help, though she didn't know how. She asked Atsa if the soldiers would really attack. The woman's eyes were sad. They always come. They never stop. That night, the leader called his warriors together. The firelight flickered across his face as he spoke in his language, his voice steady but burning with emotion. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone told her everything. This was no simple raid. It was about survival, pride, and the defense of their home. After the meeting, he approached her tent. She stood before him, her hands clenched together, trying to find the courage to speak. "If they come," she said quietly, "they'll destroy everything. You have women and children here?" He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "I know." "Then leave," she pleaded. "Take them away before it's too late." He shook his head. "If we run, we lose more than land. We lose who we are." His words were final, and yet there was sorrow in them. She realized that he wasn't just fighting to protect his people. He was fighting to preserve their spirit, their very existence. That night, sleep didn't come. The camp was silent, but the air was thick with anticipation. She stepped outside and looked up at the stars. They shone bright and endless, just as they had back in her old life. Yet now they seemed like cold witnesses to everything unfolding below. When she turned, she saw him again, standing near his horse, tightening the straps on his saddle. He looked ready to ride. For a moment, she wanted to call out, to ask him not to go, but the words caught in her throat. He met her eyes across the firelight, giving a slight nod before disappearing into the darkness with his men. The following days were heavy with waiting. The camp felt like it was holding its breath. The women gathered what they could, ready to flee if the battle came too close. She stayed near Atsa, helping where she could, but her mind was elsewhere. Each sound in the distance made her heart race, wondering if he was alive, if the fighting had begun. Then one night, a small group of riders returned. Their faces were weary, their clothes torn and marked with dust and blood. The leader wasn't among them. Her chest tightened. She rushed to one of the men, trying to ask what had happened, but the only words she understood were ambush and captured. Her knees nearly gave out. The camp erupted in chaos. Some wanted to go after him immediately. Others said it was too dangerous. The elders argued, their voices filled with grief. For the first time since she arrived, she saw fear in their eyes, not just for their leader, but for what his loss might mean for them all. Atsa grabbed her arm, whispering urgently, "He saved you. Now you must help save him." Her heart pounded with confusion and terror. What could she possibly do against armed soldiers or a world she didn't understand? But as she looked around the camp, the faces of people who had treated her with both caution and reluctant acceptance, she felt something shift inside her. She had been rejected by one world and carried away into another. Somehow she belonged to both. And maybe, in that fragile space between, she could find the courage to stand for something greater than her own fear. The wind rose that night, cold and sharp, carrying with it the scent of smoke and dust. The drums began again, echoing across the dark hills. And as she watched the fires burn low, she knew that the story was far from over, that the real battle had only just begun. The camp was restless that night, filled with the sound of hurried voices and crackling fires. The news of the leader's capture spread like wildfire. Every face carried fear and uncertainty. Without him, the Apache camp felt exposed, unanchored, as though the very spirit that held them together had been taken away. The women tried to calm the children, the warriors sharpened their blades in silence, and the elders gathered around the main fire, whispering prayers to the wind. She stood near the edge of the camp, her mind spinning. The night air was cold, but sweat ran down her back. Every sound, the cry of a hawk, the rustle of the trees, felt like a warning. She kept seeing his face in her mind, the quiet strength in his eyes before he rode off. She remembered how he had looked at her as if there were things he wanted to say but couldn't. Now he was somewhere out there, alone, and possibly hurt. She couldn't sit still. She moved from tent to tent, trying to understand what had happened. Some said the soldiers had set a trap near the canyon. Others believed a scout had betrayed them. No one knew for sure. The only truth was that their leader had been taken, and the soldiers were likely marching him toward the fort beyond the valley. Atsa found her near the fires, her face pale. "You must rest," the older woman said, but her voice trembled. "I can't," she whispered. "They'll kill him." Atsu's eyes softened. "He would not want you to go. You are safe here." She shook her head. "I can't stay safe while he's out there. He saved me when he could have left me to die. Won't let him face that alone." Atsa hesitated, then placed a hand on her shoulder. "If you go, take this." She handed her a small leather pouch filled with herbs. "For wounds, for courage. The road is dangerous. The soldiers will not show mercy." "I know," she said quietly, "but I have to try." Before dawn, she prepared to leave. She took a horse from the edge of the camp, a gray mare that had been used for carrying supplies. She packed little, only water, the pouch Atsa had given her, and a small knife she'd been taught to carry for protection. The camp slept behind her, silent and heavy with grief. As she mounted the horse, she looked once toward the horizon. The sky was still dark, a thin line of light just beginning to form. The trail was rough, winding through rocky hills and thick brush. Her hands trembled as she guided the horse, every step filled with uncertainty. She had never ridden so far, never gone alone into the wild. But the thought of him bound, hurt, or worse drove her forward. She didn't know what she would do when she found the soldiers. She only knew she couldn't turn back. By midday, the sun blazed high, the heat pressing down on her shoulders. Dust clung to her clothes and her throat burned with thirst. She stopped near a stream, letting the horse drink, while she knelt to splash her face. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes, listening to the steady rush of water. Then, in the distance, she heard something, a faint echo of metal clinking and voices carried by the wind. Her heart leapt. She climbed a small ridge and peered over. Far below, she saw a group of soldiers leading horses down a narrow trail. There were about 10 of them, their uniforms dusty, their rifles slung across their backs. In the center of the group, tied to one of the horses, was him. Her breath caught in her throat. He was still alive, though his hands were bound and his face bruised. He walked with a limp, his head held high despite the ropes around him. The sight filled her with both relief and rage. The soldiers treated him like a trophy, laughing as they talked among themselves. She crouched behind a boulder, her mind racing. She had no weapon strong enough to fight them, no plan that made sense. But she couldn't just watch them take him farther away. She followed them at a distance, staying hidden among the rocks and trees. Her heart beat loud in her ears. As night approached, the soldiers made camp near the edge of the canyon. They built a fire and set guards at either end. He was tied to a post near the center, too far for her to reach without being seen. She watched from the shadows, every muscle tense. The moonlight fell across his face, revealing the dirt and blood that marked it. Even bound, he looked unbroken. She waited until most of the soldiers had fallen asleep. The fire burned low, and the night grew still. Her fingers tightened around the small knife at her belt. She was going to do anything, it had to be now. Quietly, she crept down the slope, using the darkness and the sound of the wind to cover her movement. Every step felt like a lifetime. When she reached the edge of the camp, one of the guards stirred. She froze, barely breathing. He turned his head, scanned the shadows, then looked away. She exhaled slowly and moved closer. Her knees brushed against the rough earth, her palms scraped by small stones. Finally, She was beside him. His eyes opened suddenly, meeting hers in the darkness. For a moment, disbelief flickered in his gaze, followed by something deeper, a silent plea. She pressed her finger to her lips, signaling him to stay quiet. With shaking hands, she reached for the ropes binding his wrists. The knife's edge was dull, and it took everything she had not to cry out in frustration as she worked. "Why are you here?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Because you saved me," she murmured. "Now it's my turn." He shook his head weakly. "They will kill you if they find you." "I'll take that chance." The ropes finally loosened, and his hands slipped free. But before they could move, a sound cut through the night, the sharp click of a rifle being cocked. "Don't move," a soldier hissed. She froze. The guard's shadow loomed over them, his gun pointed straight at her. Panic surged through her chest. The leader, still weak, tried to step between her and the soldier, but the man kicked him hard, knocking him to the ground. The soldier grabbed her arm roughly, yanking her up. "Well, look what we've got here," he sneered. Didn't know the savage had a little lady coming for him. She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. The other soldiers stirred at the commotion, voices rising. Within moments, the camp was awake, the air thick with shouts and confusion. The leader struggled to his feet, blood trickling from his mouth, and lunged at the guard. The two crashed into the dirt, the rifle falling from his hand. She didn't think she grabbed the fallen weapon and aimed it with trembling hands. "Let him go," she shouted. "What?" Her voice broke, but it carried through the camp. The soldiers froze, surprised by her defiance. The leader used that moment to strike, knocking one of them down. Gunfire erupted, the night exploding into chaos. She ducked behind a fallen log as bullets whistled past her. Smoke and dust filled the air. The horse she'd ridden reared in panic, breaking free and galloping into the darkness. Through the haze, she saw him fighting, his movements fierce despite his wounds. He grabbed a fallen blade, turning it against his captors. 2 soldiers went down, but more closed in around him. Her heart pounded as she fired the rifle blindly, the recoil jolting through her arms. 1 soldier fell, and the others scattered for cover. The fire spread from a tipped-over lantern, flames licking the dry grass. The camp turned into a blur of heat, smoke, and shouting. She stumbled toward him, coughing from the smoke, and reached his side. His arm was bleeding, but his eyes were steady. "We have to go," she gasped. He nodded, grabbing her hand. Together they ran toward the canyon's edge, bullets chasing them through the night. The drop below was steep, the darkness endless. Behind them, the soldiers shouted, voices closing in. He looked back once, his breath ragged. "Do you trust me?" She hesitated for only a heartbeat.
Yes.
He pulled her close, and before she could think, they leapt from the ledge into the shadows below. The wind tore at her clothes, the ground rushing up to meet them. She braced herself for the fall, her scream lost in the roar of the night. When they hit the water at the bottom of the canyon, everything went black. The world spun into silence. The last thing she felt was the warmth of his hand gripping hers, refusing to let go. Even as the river swept them into the unknown, the first light of dawn crept over the hills, washing the desert in pale gold. The fire from the night before had burned down to soft embers, and the smell of smoke mixed with the cool air. She sat by the dying fire, her eyes on the horizon, her mind heavy with what had happened. Everything had changed so suddenly that it felt unreal, like waking from a dream she couldn't quite understand. The fear that had once filled her heart was gone, replaced by something she couldn't name. Maybe it was peace, maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe it was the strange pull she now felt toward the man everyone had once told her to fear. He was sitting a few feet away, sharpening his knife with quiet focus. The early light touched his face, showing the scars that told of battles long past. He looked strong, yet weary, like a man who had carried the weight of the world for too long. There was no trace of the ruthless Apache warrior others had spoken of in whispers. What she saw instead was a man who had fought not for glory but for survival. And in that moment, she realized he was as human as she was. The memory of the night before lingered between them. Chaos, the confrontation, the truth that had finally come out, it had left them both shaken. She had learned things that tore through every belief she had carried about her people and his. The lies, the betrayals, the endless cycle of hate between settlers and natives, it all seemed foolish now. In the middle of the desert, surrounded by nothing but silence and sky, she understood how small they all were against the vastness of the land. He glanced up at her, his dark eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. There was no anger there anymore, only quiet understanding. "You should rest," he said in a low voice, his accent thick, but his tone soft. She nodded but didn't move. Sleep felt impossible when her thoughts refused to slow down. She had left everything behind: the safety of her town, the man she once loved, the life she thought she wanted. And now here she was, beside the very man who had been called the most feared Apache in the land. She didn't know what future waited for her. The world beyond these hills would not forgive Isley. The settlers would never understand her choices, and the Apache might never accept her fully. But for the first time, she didn't feel lost. The fear of rejection no longer defined her. She had been rejected once by the man she loved, but that pain now felt like a distant echo. It had led her here to something far deeper than she ever expected, to truth, to courage, to compassion. He stood and walked toward his horse, adjusting the saddle. "When the sun is higher, we ride," he said. "There are still men searching for us. It will not stop." She felt a tremor of worry, but didn't speak. He paused, looking back at her. "You are not prisoner anymore," he said after a moment. "You choose what happens now." The words struck something deep within her. Choice. It was the one thing she had never truly been given. Every path before had been chosen for her by her father, by society, by the man who had turned her away. But now, in this wild land with no witnesses, no rules, she had the freedom to decide who she would be. "I'll ride with you," she said quietly. He nodded once, not surprised. There was no joy or pride in his expression, only calm acceptance. Together they began to pack what little they had left. The silence between them was not heavy anymore. It was peaceful. As the morning grew brighter, they rode through the canyons, the sound of hooves echoing against the stone walls.
Oh.
The wind carried the scent of sage and dust. She felt the vastness of the land surround her, endless and untamed. It made her feel small, yet alive in a way she had never known before. The journey was long, and the sun burned overhead, but neither complained. There was a sense of purpose guiding them forward. By late afternoon, they reached a ridge overlooking the valley below. From here, she could see the distant smoke of camps and the shimmer of a river cutting through the land. It was beautiful and lonely all at once. He stopped his horse and looked out across the horizon. "This is where my people once lived," he said quietly. "Before the soldiers came, before everything changed." She could hear the sadness in his voice, deep and unhealed. The loss was too great for words. She wanted to say something to comfort him, but nothing seemed enough. Instead, she simply reached out, placing her hand on his arm. He didn't move for a long time, then finally turned his head slightly toward her. That single, small gesture was more powerful than any words could be. They made camp near the river as the sky turned orange and red. The world seemed still, as if holding its breath. She watched him kneel by the water, washing the dust from his face. The firelight danced across his skin, and for the first time, she saw not the image others had painted of him, but the man himself, strong, flawed, and deeply human. He had protected her when he didn't have to. He had given her the truth when it would have been easier to lie. And in his silence, she had found a kind of peace she never thought possible. That night, the sound of crickets filled the air. The stars stretched endlessly above them. She lay awake, staring at the sky, thinking of how far she had come. The girl who once wept over lost love was gone. The woman she had become was braver, shaped by the wildness of the land and the kindness of the man beside her. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "Do you think the fighting will ever end?" He was quiet for a long time before answering. "Not soon, but someday, maybe, when people remember that we all come from the same earth." His words stayed with her long after the fire burned out. The next morning, as they prepared to move on, she turned to him and said, "Then let's find that place. The one where it can finally end." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "We will try." And so they rode on, side by side, two souls who had once belonged to different worlds, now bound by the same hope. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with danger and doubt, but neither turned back. They had already faced fear, loss, and rejection. What waited for them beyond the horizon no longer frightened them. As they disappeared into the vast land, the wind carried away the last traces of their old lives. The story of the woman rejected by the man she loved and claimed by the most feared Apache in the land was no longer one of sorrow. It had become one of courage and rebirth. She had learned that love could be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the heart had to break before it could truly be free. In the quiet expanse of the desert, where the sky met the earth in endless silence, they found their beginning, not as enemies, not as captor and captive, but as two people daring to believe that peace was possible. And though the world around them still burned with conflict, their journey carried a simple truth that echoed across the wild frontier: that love, once found in its purest form, could heal even the deepest wounds.